why is US trying to ban TikTok?
So, the story of TikTok, it started, of course, as Musical.ly. It was this lip syncing app. And then all of a sudden it was, it now has 100 million DAUs in America, which is kind of unbelievable. I think a lot of people have the concern that once an app goes from, gets to that level of scale, you can have a real impact on what a whole country is thinking. I mean, there are some incredible polls that people under 25, 2/3 of their news they get is from TikTok. If you are a country who has some issues with the US, who has the ability to shape the news environment by just changing a few knobs on an algorithm, that's a very tempting thing to do.
はい、PIVOTの竹下です。今日のテーマは、アメリカの政治のプロたちが中国をどう見ているのかっていうことです。最近だとTikTok をですね、バンしようとしてたりとか、例えば日本のビジネスパーソンにとっても、この対中関係っていうのはすごく重要なので、アメリカの政治のプロ中のプロはどう見ているのかっていうのをテーマにしたいと思います。でゲストはジョーダン・スナイダーさんという人なんですが、彼はですね、この China Talk というすごく面白いポッドキャストをやっていて、中国に興味があるアメリカ人、これみんな聞いてます。5万人ぐらいですかね、今登録者がいて、大統領補佐官とか、大使とか、主要人物が出ているポッドキャストです。彼はちょうど今、日本に来日中なので、PIVOTにお呼びして、アメリカの政治のプロが中国をどう見ているのかということを徹底的に深掘りしたいと思います。So, Jordan Schneider, welcome to PIVOT.
So great to be here.
Great. So is it your first time in Japan?
It is not, but it's I've been a tourist 3 or 4 times. I was actually here in February of 2020, right before COVID. It's at a Blackpink concert in Fukuoka where I must have gotten a lot of people sick. But it's great to be back.
Wow. So you host a podcast called ChinaTalk. Could you explain to our audience what ChinaTalk is and introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So for the past 7 years, I've run a podcast and newsletter called ChinaTalk, which is focused on US-China relations and technology policy. So I interview analysts, journalists, government officials about sort of US-China tensions, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and the way governments around the world are responding to those issues. I also do some fun stuff like maybe 20% like culture, like television reviews. But I think a lot of the themes that you focus on here at the Pivot, I do in a more US-China context.
Wow, how many listeners do you have right now?
So it's 40,000 across the podcast and newsletter, which is nowhere near the success you guys have had. But it's it's a niche topic, I think, in the US and in English language.
Great. So today I have so many things I want to ask you, but so 3 topics. So number 1 is US-China relations, some history, and number 2 is about recent news, why US is banning TikTok. And number 3, I want to listen to your advice about which path Japan should take. So number 1, could you talk about the US-China relations?
Gotcha. Yeah. So let me start the clock when Nixon goes to China.
Nixon, okay. So, history,
So, or even before that. So, 1945, the U.S. was in favor of the nationalists. The nationalists lose. You have the communists in power. Mao, not a huge fan of America. And then this sort of Sino-Soviet split happens. The U.S. decides that, or Nixon and Kissinger in particular decide that they can reach out become allies or, increasingly allies with China as a way to isolate the Soviet Union. So basically, from 1973 all the way through 2013, you've had, 50 years of the US and China increasingly sort of becoming economically integrated. Over that period, of course, you have reform and opening in China. China grows from, one of the poorest countries in the world to a global economic powerhouse. All of that is predicated on the Western policy assumption that a sort of growing, increasingly capitalist, increasingly globalized China is going to be good for the world and ultimately lead to a more liberal ultimately, hopefully, maybe democratic PRC. What happened over the course of the 2010s is 2 things. I think first, China got big enough to start to be scary. So you can sort of overlook the fact that it was an autocracy in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s because it's like, 5% of global GDP, 10% of global GDP. But as China starts to grow bigger, in the 2010s, and it continues growing at 7-8%, while the U.S. is down in 1 to 2%. You've got the Great Recession, all of that slowing down the Western world. Then all of a sudden you start to look at the country in a different way and sort of reassess some of the assumptions that went through that whole policy, starting in Nixon and all the way through the 2010s. And what the U.S. Policymakers saw was a China that was not liberalizing. A Xi Jinping who was very much committed to sort of centralized party control and, increasingly rule by one man. And not only sort of did you see a lack of liberalization domestically, but also on the international front, everyone talked about Deng, this idea of hide your power and bide your time. But Xi thought the time was now, that China had grown enough and was, had enough sort of diplomatic, economic, and military muscle to start bullying countries around.
So he stopped hiding.
He stopped hiding. Okay. He started showing his colors.
Yes.
He's like, look, we're a big country. We should be treated differently. We should get our way in the South China Sea. We should get our way with these sort of island disputes and whatnot. And that, I think, in particular, coupled with changing the constitution and Xi deciding that he's going to be there as long as he wants to be there, led to a real reassessment in the U.S., but also in other capitals like Tokyo and in Brussels, that the sort of terms of engagement that the West, or maybe that the G7 had with China needed to start to change. And that's really what we saw in the latter half of the 2010s and through the Biden administration, is the U.S. and other countries around the world trying to grapple with a powerful and not particularly friendly country, which is not really developing in the ways that many had hoped over the past few decades.
Right. So when did U.S. realize that China is different? Because in the after 2001, when China joined the WTO, there was some optimistic view that China will change. They'll join the global community. They'll contribute to the world. So when did U.S. realize that, oh, this is wrong?
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating question. So I think there was a real bipartisan consensus. You mentioned the WTO.
Yes.
I remember this line. There's a famous line of Bill Clinton when someone asked him, look, China's going to start to create this great firewall. He was like, look, controlling information is like trying to glue Jell-O to a wall. It just won't happen. You can't do it. And both parties really assumed that the more China engaged with the rest of the world, the more open a society it would become. And starting in Hu, but particularly with Xi, that assumption proved wrong. And I think, it's funny. I recently interviewed Ambassador Rahm Emanuel on my podcast. He has a quote when he was mayor in Chicago from 2013 saying, we want to make Chicago the most friendly city in the world to China. And here he is 10 years later, making fun of the PRC every day on his Twitter, right? So I think it really is towards the end of the Obama administration and then really with the Trump administration, you had a very significant shift in going from seeing China as this little, this country that'll kind of get itself together at some point and recognize the global rules of the world to a problem and a competitor that the U.S. really needed to find a new strategy to address for the coming decades.
So what was the reason? Is it because Xi's characteristics, or is it because China can gain confidence, or what's the main reason that China changed?
Some argue that China never changed.
Okay. We didn't realize it.
Yeah, okay. I think there was sort of, look, we've had the Communist Party in power for the past 75 years. And the sort of leadership has made different calculations of what makes sense to sort of escalate from an international perspective. Should the control of society be tighter or looser? Look, in the 70s and 80s, Deng towards Japan basically said, we're not going to talk about, as long as you guys invest in Japan, we're not going to talk about history. We're not going to deal with sort of the territorial disputes. He said, the quote is we'll leave that to another generation. Now, I think two things have happened. From a domestic perspective, look, they saw what happened in 1989, and they don't want that to repeat. And I think sort of as Hu and Xi in particular really started to see Western influence and Western values as a threat as a sort of ideological threat to what the Communist Party is trying to do domestically. So that sort of led to a domestic tightening of the environment. What happened with Hong Kong and Xinjiang also sort of very, very concerning from a more liberal perspective. And then we also have sort of on the international side, as we were talking before, Deng, he invaded Vietnam. He didn't invade Taiwan because he understood the sort of level of power that China could project back in the 70s and 80s was relatively limited. Xi has a different conception of that. He's invested very dramatically in building up the PLA to be a globally competitive player. And I think, look, when you spend a lot of money to buy a toy, sometimes you get excited and want to use it. So look, he hasn't done anything really dramatic or awful, but I think the sort of growth and investment and technological development we've seen across a lot of different sectors has given Chinese leadership more confidence to sort of take what may have been sort of latent ambitions over the past 50, even 75 years, and start to show them and portray them more aggressively internationally.
So when I listen to Secretary Blinken's press conferences and also President Biden's remarks, so the U.S. right now is thinking that China is like the only country who can challenge the current international order. Could you elaborate on that and how the U.S. is looking at China? It's not only an economic superpower, but a country that can reshape the global atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And I think sort of over the past 4 years, I've gotten actually more confident that that's not really going to happen.
Interesting.
So, I think you had a sort of like a high watermark maybe in the appeal of the Chinese model, say circa 2020, 2021, where China had figured out how to control COVID. It was still growing relatively fast, while the rest of the world was kind of a mess. But sort of what you've seen over the past few years is the U.S. in particular really regain its footing. You see companies blowing up like NVIDIA, OpenAI, American innovation, right? And broadly the sort of the American model seems to be has had a little good run at the moment. And I think the sort of what we've seen over more broadly is China really struggles to have a broader ideological appeal, which is not necessarily the case when sort of liberal democracies are making their pitch around the world. So look, we'll see what Trump does to the U.S. It could get really messy. It could get really messy soon. But overall, it seems like China is having a more difficult time than maybe they would have hoped in sort of reshaping the world to be a state that they would like to see.
So since you mentioned Trump, what would happen if President Trump would be re-elected?
I don't know. You tell me, man. So from a domestic perspective, from a U.S. politics perspective, it's going to be really messy and awful. I think what you saw in the first term is there were a lot of people who were not crazy who ended up working for him. So the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Treasury and Commerce Secretaries were all kind of mainstream-ish Republicans, not total radical.
And they can sometimes disagree
They can disagree.
So they're like the balancers of the...
But the problem is all those people left. All those people quit on January 6th. They're not coming back. And the folks who've stuck with Donald Trump, who are going to be the ones who are actually implementing the policies in the White House, running the agencies, are very, very radical fringe people. And so what I'm particularly worried about from a domestic perspective is a lot of the kind of not necessarily legal guardrails, but institutional guardrails of the Department of Justice, of all these different ministries having, people who've worked in them for the past 30 years and sort of know the rules of the road and maybe, would push the envelope here and there, but aren't really trying to burn the whole system down. Those folks won't be there. Instead, you'll get people who just fundamentally think that, the Department of Justice, for instance, shouldn't be independent and they should be fine to prosecute Trump's enemies or whatever.
Well, that would be a mess.
It's going to be really, really, really bad. On the international side, what Trump's going to do with respect to Japan and Asia policy more broadly, I think is a really open question. We had we had this like Trump-Abe bromance, right? You guys remember the Golden Golf Club.
Right.
And I think sort of at the end of the day, Trump, he talked a lot about, you guys need to spend more on the, on your military and whatever, but it could have been a lot worse, I think. What I'm particularly worried about is him just like really not caring at all. And, China potentially seeing Trump's election as an opportunity for, to really push the envelope a little more aggressively than you've seen over the past 8 years, on the assumption that actually, if you can be pretty sure that Biden would come to Korea or Japan or Taiwan's defense, that's very much an open question, I think, with Trump. So, I'm more worried than I should be because over the past 75 years, you've had a really strong bipartisan commitment from American presidents across the political aisles to the Japan alliance, to the defense of Korea and Taiwan. And Trump, I think, is the first president we've had who just kind of doesn't care. And that's a scary place to be.
Right. So let's talk about TikTok, given that context, and we now understand the history from Nixon. So why is U.S. trying to ban TikTok? Because when we are living in Japan, it's very difficult to grasp that context. So could you explain to us?
Gotcha, sure. So, the story of TikTok, it started, of course, as Musical.ly. It was this lip syncing app. And then all of a sudden, it was, it's very, I'm sure your users have used it at one point or another. It's very addictive. Yes. People love short video. It, makes you dumber, but it's like, it's sort of some great dopamine hits. It now has 100 million DAUs in America, which is kind of unbelievable. And I think a lot of people have the concern that once an app goes from, gets to that level of scale, you can have a real impact on what a whole country is thinking. I mean, there are some incredible polls that people under 25, like 2/3 of their news they get is from TikTok, anything else. So look, if you are a country who has some issues with the US, who has the ability to shape the news environment by just changing a few knobs on an algorithm, that's a very tempting thing to do. Right. I think American policymakers have really, thought about this analogy of like, look, if during the Cold War, would you have let the Soviet Union buy up network channels like NBC or
CNN?
CBS? Exactly. Okay. And the conclusion that a lot of those folks have come to is no. That it's important for domestic media to be ultimately in the hands of Americans who aren't, who aren't subject to a Chinese national security law that really gives Chinese firms very little leeway when it comes to rejecting Chinese government demands for this and that. So we've had a very slow burn of this story. Trump initially was going to ban it all the way back in 2020. Right. That kind of didn't happen. Biden thought that they would pass a law earlier in his tenure. Didn't happen. He was maybe going to do an executive order. It might have been illegal. And finally, over the past month or so, we had a law out of the House pass by a pretty substantial margin. So like 350 to 100, which, for your listeners, like very rarely do Republicans and Democrats vote together on anything. Right. That basically said that TikTok would have 6 months either to sell to a foreign, sell to a non-Chinese firm, basically, or Apple and Google would have to basically stop it from operating. So that right now has passed the House, but in the Senate, it's still up for debate whether or not it's going to go through.
Right. Because what puzzles me is because, 99% of TikTok content is just like fun music videos, and it's not too political, too much news. So maybe it's different from Russians trying to buy CNN or Russians interfering the presidential election via Facebook. So do you think kind of overreacting in some way?
Well, I mean, look, it's like most of your most of your content on television is entertainment, but there's still news there too. And if this is, I think the nail on the coffin really for TikTok was what they did a few days before it was going to
be push alerts,
Where basically they conducted a lobbying campaign and they targeted specific districts of folks on specific committees and told people, call your congressman to save TikTok.
Right.
And that sort of made the subtext text where this is an app that can really be used to influence politics. And look, you have politicians who use the app to raise money to get the voice out. And look, if we're running against each other and you secretly get 10x the views that I do, like that's really powerful. That's super helpful. So I think there's a real understanding, and there was a bit of a turning point too with TikTok, where at first they were actually banning any political content. But what was fascinating is what happened over the course of Black Lives Matter. Is for the first few days you have George Floyd die, and people start making videos about how awful this is, how we need to go to the street and protest. Those videos got banned by TikTok because they still wanted to pretend that this app could exist in a democratic society, but the American users wouldn't accept that. They're like, look, this is an app where, I am interacting with people. It's a place where I want to have free expression.
Right.
And they had to unshadow ban that. And then all of a sudden you have all this political discussion and content. So even if it's only, 10% of the content, if that's where you get all your news, if that's where you're going to get your information that's going to decide where you're going to vote, if you're going to protest or not, it's an extremely powerful instrument. And I think one that the vast majority of sort of the American political class, at least, has concluded can't exist in its current form going forward.
So discussion is mainly on national security, or were there discussions about freedom of speech? Because banning TikTok is some way kind of expressing the freedom of expression. So,
I mean, sort of, but like, you can always just make a video on YouTube Shorts. You can make it on Instagram Reels. I don't quite understand that argument because, look, India banned TikTok. It's not like Indians couldn't express themselves anymore. They have good filters. Like you won't be able to use TikTok's filters. Is that really like a restriction of your freedom of speech? I think it'll kind of suck for the creators that have invested in that channel over other channels. But at the end of the day, my guess is that if it's banned, 2 weeks later, people will have forgotten about it. Everyone will say, look, follow me on this other channel. And, people care about their creators. They don't really care about the app at the end of the day. So my guess is like, if it disappears, it'll be kind of awkward. And then it'll be like, rest in peace Vine. If that was a thing in Japan, it's like, look, it's a time.
Or Facebook Reels or something.
Look, it's a medium. It's not really a voice. And like the voice that's going to get, the free speech that's going to get banned at the end of the day is TikTok being able to send push notifications to lobby. I don't necessarily think that like foreign companies have a right to freedom of speech in America. That seems like a weird principle to uphold. If the US government was saying Americans can't make short videos, period, that would be a problem. But look, there are other outlets. It's not really going to change anything in the broad scheme of things. Aside from there no longer being a Chinese-owned platform where like most young people get their news and information from.
Right. Do you think Japan should ban TikTok?
It's an interesting question, and one that I think democracy should really grapple with. It is like, I think media is important to a healthy democracy. And I think, if news media was dominated by Russia Today, if it was dominated by Al Jazeera or other sort of foreign state organizations, like that would be a problem. The more worried you are about a country influencing you and the more contentious the relationship is, I think the more tempted that China would potentially be to interfere. And
should we stick to the United States, or should we have our own path or own way of thinking?
Look, it's a really interesting question.